Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 4, the Legislative Branch. It is Lesson 9 about the executive process of creating legislation. In this lesson, you'll learn about the proposal of legislation by the executive branch, the presentment clause, about the presidential veto, about veto overrides, and about pocket vetoes. Over the last several lessons, we've been building this model of the legislative process, and we'll be able to now complete it in this lesson. But before we get to finishing that model, we need to talk about how the president and the people that work for him in the executive branch have a role in the proposal of legislation. In other words, the beginning of the process. We may normally think of the president involved in the end of the process, as we've talked about previously in this course when we talked about checks and balances. But the president actually has a role in the beginning of the legislative process also. It's an informal role. In fact, much of the legislation considered by Congress begins with the president or other people in the executive branch. Now, this makes some sense because they're the ones carrying out the laws. They're the ones most likely to recognize problems with the laws as they try to perform them. They can then provide that feedback to Congress with suggestions of how laws need to be corrected by the passage of new laws. A particular example of where the president and the executive branch are involved in informally proposing legislation is the federal budget, which the president traditionally proposes every year. Now, even though the president proposes a budget every year, Congress seems to never actually pass the budget that the president proposes. Nonetheless, presidents keep proposing them. But when we say that the president proposes it, this is an informal proposition. The president is making suggestions that Congress, he hopes, will follow. But to get it actually officially proposed, a member of Congress, a friend of the president, a friend of somebody in the executive branch, needs to stand up and actually make the proposal. The way this actually works between the executive branch and the legislative branch is members of the executive branch that have ideas for laws may even type them up as officially the way the laws would be. They then send them to members of Congress, generally people who are members of the same political party as them, and ask them to enter them into the legislative process by officially proposing them. Now, just remember that members of Congress are the only ones that can officially propose legislation, but the president, the people who work for him in the executive branch, do all kinds of unofficial proposing of legislation. So in that way, the president has a role at the beginning of the process of legislating. So now let's return to our big diagram of the legislative process that we've been creating and look at it to the point that we had finished it in the previous lesson. We have the two houses of Congress passing bills, laws that they hope will eventually become official and enacted. And they do this by first having the laws proposed, then committees considering them, and then them be considering by the entire floor. And then if one house starts it, they send it to the other house to work through that same process, back and forth, vice versa. And then eventually they have a conference committee meets that tries to work out the differences between their two versions of the law, which then are sent back to each house to be voted on by them and hopefully approved in identical form. Now, when you get through all this process, you have still a bill, a proposed law. It's now been officially approved by Congress in identical form by both houses, but it isn't a law yet. Instead, after the two houses of Congress have both voted on the bill and approved it, it must then be presented to the President of the United States. We can then add this step to the diagram, where you now see a solid line moving from both the House and the Senate, pointing to the President's box, where the President can then either add his signature or veto the law. Now, those opportunities are presented to the President in the Constitution. After a bill is presented to him, it says that he'll either sign it or he can return it to Congress with his objections. So, a president may sign a law, or, as it said, return it to Congress with his objections, and that is what we know as a veto. That's what the president is really doing when he vetoes a law. He's sending it back to Congress with some sort of official reason added to it about why he thinks it shouldn't be approved. Back when George Washington was president of the United States, he thought that he should only veto laws that were unconstitutional. So you could actually go and look up when he vetoed his very first law and sent it to Congress. He sent a very detailed explanation of why he thought that law was unconstitutional. Presidents today may veto laws for all kinds of reasons. Maybe they just personally dislike it. Maybe it conflicts with their ideological point of views. But they need to provide some reason when they send it back to Congress. That's what the Constitution asks them to do. So if the president, though, instead of vetoing a law, signs it, it's then finally approved and it becomes a law. We've actually completed the legislative process then. But what if the president, instead of signing it into law, sends it back to Congress? Well, the Constitution provides a way for that bill that's been rejected by the president to still potentially become a law. It says that if 2/3 of the House that it's sent back to, which is the House that originated the bill, still approve it despite the president vetoing it, and then the members of the other House also approve it by a 2/3 majority, it will become a law whether the president vetoed it or not. So now we can add that to our diagram. See now that I've added 2 dashed lines coming from the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate, where they presumably would vote by a 2/3 majority to override the president's veto. And then going up around to the other side and pointing to the law box also. This shows that there's actually 2 mechanisms by which a law that's been approved by both houses of Congress can become a law. That bill can either be signed by the president, or if it's rejected by the president, it can be approved by a 2/3 majority of both houses of Congress, override the president's veto, and become a law anyway. Now, there is a special circumstance where the president can veto a law in a strange way. The Constitution provides that any bill that is sent to the president that is not returned to Congress within 10 days will become law without his signature. So a president can't just sit on a bill and ignore it and get away with killing it that way, normally speaking. A bill comes from Congress. If he doesn't sign it, it automatically becomes a law. And occasionally presidents will do this. They don't personally support a bill, but they don't want to take the political heat for vetoing it, so they just let it become law without their signature. It's a way for them to the future to deny that they actually supported the thing since they never signed it, but to not cause a fight with Congress by actually vetoing it. But if Congress sends this bill to the president, and it's in the last 10 days that they are meeting before they adjourn, then a new rule comes into play under the Constitution. If that bill shows up on the president's desk in the last 10 days, the founders figured he wasn't being given adequate time to consider it and then return it to Congress before they left. And so in that case, he doesn't have to. He can simply ignore it, and rather than it automatically becoming a law, which would be the case at any other time than those last 10 days before Congress adjourns, instead it will automatically not become a law. So let's make sure we have this straight in our mind. A bill that's sent to the president with more than 10 days before Congress adjourns, that the president then does not sign or return, automatically becomes a law. But a bill sent to the president with less than 10 days before Congress adjourns, which he then does not sign or return, automatically is not a law. He in effect vetoed it without actually vetoing it. Now again, this is a opportunity that the president can take political advantage of. Maybe there's a law he doesn't like that he would like to veto, but he doesn't want to take the political heat for being the person that actually kills the law. So if they send it to him too late during the last 10 days before they adjourn, he can take advantage of that to simply ignore it and have it die. And later on, if anyone ever asks him, did you veto that? He can say, oh no, I didn't. I didn't veto that. And that way avoid responsibility for it in the political heat, but have it die, which is what he wanted to have happen. So when the president does this, when he kills a bill without actually vetoing it, by simply ignoring it, when it was sent to him with only 10 days or less before Congress adjourned, that's called a pocket veto. It's referring to the idea that the proposed law, this bill, can be handed to the president for his signature, and he simply puts it in his pocket and ignores it. And because it's in the last 10 days that Congress is meeting, him simply ignoring it results in it effectively being vetoed without him ever actually taking it out of his pocket. So now let's review what we learned in this lesson. What laws can be officially proposed by the president? A declaration of war, the federal budget, interstate trade regulations, or none. The key word here is officially, as in officially proposed. The president cannot officially propose any laws. Yes, he can make unofficial suggestions to Congress, but they must be officially proposed by members of Congress. To the president, must it be printed for the public? Must it be reviewed by the Supreme Court? Or must funds be withdrawn from the Treasury to pay for it? It must be presented to the President of the United States for the President to then decide whether he'll sign it or veto it. So what does a veto actually do? Does it approve a bill? Does it void a bill? Does it return a bill to Congress for their further consideration? Or does it force changes to a bill? Now, while it certainly has the potential to force changes to a bill, what it immediately does is returns the bill to Congress, where they can decide whether they want to try to vote on it again and override the president. Well, how can a veto be overridden? Is it overridden by a majority vote of the House? By a 2/3 vote of the Senate? By a majority vote of both houses? Or by a 2/3 vote of both houses? A veto override requires a supermajority, a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress. When may a pocket veto happen? Can it happen at any time? Does it happen during the first 10 days of a congressional session? Or can it only happen during the last 10 days of a congressional session? Or does it happen during a president's last year in office? A pocket veto can only happen during the last 10 days in which Congress is meeting before it adjourns. That completes this lesson about the executive's involvement in the legislative process. Our next lesson, also from Unit 4, will be Lesson 10, about the negative side of legislation.